Times Daily and the Alabama Music Hall of Fame for partnering with us on this historic event. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my friend, co-worker, and associate director of the center here, Jana Malone. It's my pleasure to introduce a man of great vision. He's been a true friend and supporter of the commercial music and entertainment industry programs here at UNA. It was through his leadership that the Entertainment Industry Center was established here, which makes it possible for us to participate in events such as these today. Please welcome the president of this institution, Robert Potts.
Thank you, Bob. On behalf of the university and all its people, I'd like to give you a warm welcome to our program tonight and to our campus. I would be remiss if I did not thank the Times Daily and the Music Hall of Fame and the other sponsors of Celebrate 2000 who made a series of wonderful programs possible in our community during this year leading up to the new millennium. Also, I'd like, on behalf of the university, to thank Terry Pace and Robert Palmer for their wonderful award-winning articles. I don't know what awards they're going to win, but they're going to win some big ones, I think, for those articles on the music industry here in the Shoals area. And certainly for the distinguished panelists today that have been on the campus and have given of their time and efforts to put on an outstanding program today, we thank you too. And I'd like to add my thanks to Bob Garfreri and Jana Malone for their wonderful work with our Entertainment Industry Center here. You know, our commercial music program and its outgrowth, the Entertainment Industry Center, have been inextricably intertwined with the history of the music business in this area. And so I think it's very appropriate that they have taken such a large role in planning and executing the events of today. And of course, the men who made the music, Buddy, Sam, Rick, and Jerry, they have busy schedules, and to come here all together tonight, we're really, really excited about that. In fact, somebody told me it might be Buddy's birthday today. So, if my information is true, I think that doubly shows to be away from his family and his home to be with us tonight is so very, very special, as with all the other panelists here this evening. So again, on behalf of the University of North Alabama and its students and its faculty and staff, its Board of Trustees, welcome and have a wonderful evening tonight. Thank you.
I'm Kathy Silverberg, Executive Editor of the Times Daily, and just on behalf of our newspaper, I would very much like to just join with Robert Potts in welcoming you here tonight, in telling you how happy we are to have all of you. It certainly is gratifying to see the interest there is in this wonderful musical heritage we have here in the Muscle Shoals area. And I'm confident with all of you and the wonderful musicians we've been hearing from all day, the rhythm of the river will just continue to roll right along. It's a very exciting time. Just wanted to let you know a little bit about Celebrate 2000, which is an event that the Times Daily has been spearheading throughout this year with the help of some very dedicated sponsors and partners we have here in the community. Through that program, we have been able to bring some wonderful seminars and programs such as we've had today. And I want to thank all of you who have been a part of that. Particularly, I'd like to thank our partners, SunTrust Bank, Helen Keller Hospital, TVA, the City of Florence, Books A Million, and of course UNA. I also want to particularly thank, as we all have heard so much from today, but Terry Pace and Robert Palmer truly have worked tirelessly to put this program together, and we're all very grateful for their efforts. And now I'm going to turn it over to them, and we're just all very anxious to hear this program tonight. Thank you all again.
Thank you all very much and welcome. I'm Terry Pace and this is my colleague Robert Palmer. And yes, a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of hours did go into this project and the newspaper series which preceded it. But make no mistake about it, for both of us, this was a true labor of love. In fact, it's been a lifelong labor of love. As natives of this area, we have been fans of Muscle Shoals music all our lives. So we have had a blast today examining the past, present, and the future of the Muscle Shoals music industry, and I hope that you have enjoyed it too. Just to give you a little bit of background, earlier this year, Robert and I were assigned to work on a project that we had sort of been toying with for quite some time. We wanted to try to look at Muscle Shoals music and the wonderful musical heritage of this area, take it back as far as we could, try to put the pieces of the puzzle together in a way that made sense, and see if there was a thread that ran through it. And the thread that we found was the river. James Joyner had first indicated to us that he had heard that the American Indians who first settled in this area, who lived on the banks of the Tennessee River, were very musical people, and who played musical instruments, who made musical instruments, and who traded in musical instruments. And then, of course, we had the Celtic white settlers who moved in with their own musical heritage. Later on, we had the African-American slaves who moved in. And then, of course, later on, W.C. Handy, the father of the blues, became the first to take this music out of this area somewhere else to Memphis and to start taking a portion of the Muscle Shoals sound, at least one strain, one element of it, to an international audience. And the river remains a recurrent theme, a motif in Muscle Shoals music throughout every stage of the development of this music industry. So we called the series Muscle Shoals Sounds, the Rhythm of the River. And it was a 7-part series, concluding with the contemporary hit makers, including 2 who were here today, Mac McAnally and Gary Baker, who have homes and studios on the banks of the Tennessee River, making music on that scenic river, overlooking that scenic river that first inspired the Indians hundreds and thousands of years ago. Tonight, after exploring the past, present, and future with all the panel discussions that we did today, we wanted to try and look at the 4 most significant, most influential music achievers associated with this area, with Muscle Shoals music, or achievers who had worked here in Muscle Shoals or were from Muscle Shoals who had gone off to other areas like W.C. Handy did, and who took this music to an international audience. As we looked at this, as we explored and researched the history, we looked at the post-World War II era, and we saw that 4 people in particular were, in fact, the men who made the music. 2 of them, one in the field of blues and later in rock and roll, went to Memphis. Another, in the field of country, went to Nashville and helped start the music industries and helped bring those music industries to worldwide prominence. Another stayed here in Muscle Shoals and became the architect of the Muscle Shoals music industry and of the world-famous Muscle Shoals sound. Another was already a well-established music producer in New York with a tremendous track record of his own, who heard something here and who wanted to be a part of it, who came down here, became the godfather of Muscle Shoals music, and adopted it as his second home. The foundation for this panel and bringing these 4 pioneers together is that if you take the achievements of these 4 men, the influence of these 4 men, their musical legacies, if you remove those from the picture, you don't have popular music in the 20th century. These truly are the men who made the music. 4 international musical pioneers associated with Muscle Shoals music. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce them one by one. Our first panelist is a native of Florence who moved to Nashville in 1951, where he became one of Music City's most successful and influential forces. He has published such pop and country classics as Heartbreak Hotel and King of the Road and The Green, Green Grass of Home. And he's also written and produced hits for Joe Tex, Bill Anderson, Conway Twitty, Exile, T.G. Shepherd, Ronnie McDowell, and many, many others. His Nashville business interests have included the Sound Shop Recording Studio, the publishing giant Tree International, and the world-famous Stockyard Restaurant. He was the first person inducted into the Alabama Music Hall of Fame in 1985. His autobiography, By the Seat of My Pants, My Life in Country Music, was published in 1993, and just last week, here in his hometown, he released a solo album of big band music called Mixed Emotions. Let's have a warm homecoming and happy birthday welcome for Mr. Buddy Killen. Our second panelist is a native of Phil Campbell, who founded a company with Tom Stafford and Billy Sherrill 40 years ago. And the name of that company was an acronym, F-A-M-E, FAME. It stood for Florence, Alabama Music Enterprises. This man produced the area's first national rhythm and blues hit, Arthur Alexander's R&B smash, You Better Move On, and later went on to score subsequent pop, soul, and country successes for Jimmy Hughes, Wilson Pickett, Clarence Carter. You saw Jimmy and Clarence both here today. Etta James, the Osmonds, Paul Anka, T.G. Shepherd, Jerry Reed, Shenandoah, and many, many others. He was named Record Producer of the Year for the World in 1971, and he was also inducted into the Alabama Music Hall of Fame in 1985. Fame, of course, is now in its 40th year, and this man recently produced an upcoming solo album by former Shenandoah lead singer Marty Rabin that we're all anxiously awaiting. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rick Hall. Our third panelist is a native of New York. He was a Billboard reporter who coined the term rhythm and blues to replace the term race music. He produced early Atlantic Records hits by Ray Charles, Laverne Baker, Solomon Burke, The Drifters, and many, many others. In 1966, his company Atlantic released Percy Sledge's Muscle Shoals smash, When a Man Loves a Woman, which became a #1 hit and an international sensation. This man soon brought soul singer Wilson Pickett to Rick Hall's famed studios, and in his words, fell in love with this southern method of recording. He later became known as the godfather of Muscle Shoals music, producing hits by everyone from Aretha Franklin and Bob Dylan to Willie Nelson and Dire Straits. In 1987, he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Alabama Music Hall of Fame. His autobiography, Rhythm and the Blues, was published in 1993, and his life and career will be profiled in an upcoming documentary film. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jerry Wexler. Our fourth and final panelist, like Buddy Killen, is a native of Florence. He worked in radio here in Muscle Shoals. Then in 1945, he followed W.C. Handy to Memphis, where his Memphis Recording Service studio housed early sessions by blues artist B.B. King and Howlin' Wolf. Then in 1951, he produced what is universally recognized as the world's first rock and roll record, Rocket 88 by Jackie Brinston and the Delta Cats. 3 years later, he discovered what he called a white man who could sing with a black man's soul. That's when he cut Elvis Presley's historic recording debut. Through his Sun Records label, this man launched the careers of Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison, Charlie Rich, and many others. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986 and into the Alabama Music Hall of Fame in 1987. A&E Television will profile him next June with a 2-hour installment of its highly acclaimed biography series. As Johnny Cash would say, somebody call Sam, Mr. Sam C. Phillips.
Good evening, gentlemen. Good evening. We'll start at the beginning with some early roots questions. And the first one is for you, Sam. You were born here in North Florence, and you later followed fellow Florence native W.C. Handy to Memphis. While you were growing up here in Florence, what did you hear in this area that influenced you later in your musical career?
You mean here?
Yes, sir.
I suppose that a curious soul is something that can find a bird singing and find some context in which to feel that there could be something a little bit beautiful about what sound can do to people for good. When I was a young person, I had thought so much about W.C. Handy. I knew I wasn't a good musician, but I played in the band starting in the 6th grade at Gilbert School in North Florence. And with Mr. McClure and Mr. B.F. Stewart, I got interested in John Phillips Sousa. And John is the best songwriter in the world. Don't dance so well to marches, but he really influenced me a lot. W.C. Handy, no question. All my life, I wanted to see two things in Memphis. The Mississippi River, and I was born and raised on the most beautiful river in the world right here, the Tennessee. The other one was Beale Street, to see where Handy wrote the blues. So I did hear a lot of things here in the cotton patch, cotton fields. My daddy was close to black folks. And being the youngest of 8 kids, you do what you're told to do. So I wouldn't take anything for the great experiences I have here, right in Florence and Lauderdale County. And occasionally I get across the river and try to find me a date.
Buddy, you were born and raised in Florence, but on the east side of Florence, in the area known as Sweetwater. Growing up there, what were your early musical influences?
Well, when I was about 11 years old, my dad took me to Memphis, and we bought some instruments. Before that, I'd been sitting around the little cafe down there and plunking around on my little guitar, and all my little friends would come down, and I guess we started performing there without realizing it, because people would listen to us, but we didn't think of ourselves as performers. We were just playing. So, but he took me over on the train. We came back with all these instruments, and I got all excited about it, and every little friend I had, I got him in my band, and I ended up with nothing to play. So the only thing we didn't have was a bass. So I said, well, I'll play the bass. So I started picking up a bass everywhere I'd see one. I didn't know how to play it, but I taught myself to play. And that's how I got started, putting those little bands together. And then throughout high school, we worked schools and square dances and what have you. And virtually the next day after I got out of high school, I was offered a job in the Grand Ole Opry as a bass player. So I took off and been there ever since.
Rick.
You're bad, Sam.
Rick, you grew up in Phil Campbell, which is just south of the Muscle Shoals area. What were your musical experiences there, and what brought you north to Muscle Shoals?
Poverty. Well, actually, when I was a young man, which is not long ago, I played in little high school string bands, and went to Auburn and joined in the state of Alabama string band contest. And my father was an old-fashioned singing school teacher and loved gospel, southern country gospel songs. That influenced me somewhat, but at a very early age, my sister and myself learned to sing a lot of gospel songs and perform throughout the community. And I began to pick up different instruments, mandolins, fiddles, and guitars, and spend time under shade trees on Sunday afternoon with other country people that were also impressed with or wanted to learn to play guitars. That led to, of course, eventually I got into a band that I was kind of formed and played on a radio station in Hamilton, Alabama for several years, 4 or 5 years. And played square dances every 3 or 4 nights a week. And worked at Reynolds, a local aluminum plant here. So I had 2 jobs. But eventually, the music industry would take me over and pull me away from everything else that was interesting to me in life. So I started out as a band member, almost everything. But I started out as a band member, then I became interested in writing songs, and then Billy Sherrill and I got together and started writing songs, and we got in the same band together and played for 4 or 5 years. And eventually I moved to the big city of Muscle Shoals. In my childhood and in my when I was a young adult, I thought that Muscle Shoals was New York. So when I came here, it was a big move for me, and I came here with the intentions of making it in the music business, or at least giving it a couple of years of my best efforts. Been here ever since.
Speaking of New York, by the early to mid-1960s, Jerry Wexler, you were already extremely well established at Atlantic Records as a rhythm and blues producer with Ray Charles, Laverne Baker, everyone from Joe Turner to the Drifters. But then suddenly in the mid-1960s, you headed south, first to Memphis and then to Muscle Shoals. What was the bait that brought you here?
Well, the event.
Okay? Yeah. Yeah.
Microphone.
It's not a tomato can, right, Rick?
It's a new thing. It's a new device.
I've always had engineers to do this, so. Well, I'll answer the second part of it first. How I came to come to Muscle Shoals, what triggered it was that they barred the door to me, for me, or from me in Memphis. I'd come down there originally on a tip from a wonderful gentleman named Buster Williams, who was running the pressing plant there. And at Atlantic Records, we pressed regionally to cover different areas. And Buster Williams was a fabulous Southern gentleman of the old school. And he called me up one day and said, there's a little record kicking around here that you could be interested in. So I went down, and it was Rufus and Carla, a record called Because I Love You. So I arranged with Jim Stewart to take over the record for P&B, for pressing and distribution, and made an arrangement with Jim for possible future product. Well, that record didn't do a whole lot, but then Carla Thomas came out with a record that was an instant hit. And so our relationship, my relationship personally and the company's, with Jim and his great crew became solidified. And I started to come down and watch the way they did things. My interest in recording itself had ground to a shuddering halt up north because after 10 years of working with damn good arrangers, this is not to slight them, and great musicians, the arrangers were out of ideas, the musicians were out of licks, and every time I went into the studio with the notion of making a record, I went in with forebodings of doom. And it didn't behoove me necessarily to be in the studio because I was a principal in the company and you hired people. But there was one thing about my record company, Atlantic, and that is all of the principals were line producers. They actually went to the studio and made the records. And of the major record companies, I could say that was true of only two record companies. That was Atlantic and later on Motown, where the owners made the records. Of course, in the early days, I'm talking about the major record company, in the early days, all of the indies, whether it was the Lou Chudd, or an Art Roop, or I'm trying to think of some other labels, Joe Banachek, we all went into the studio. We didn't know we were producing records. The word had really come into language, into the lexicography, if you will, by then. We just thought we were attending happenings. Somebody had to get the musicians together and say, play this music and let's get on out of here. And so we were making these records, but as I said, entropy was setting in because unhappy experiences. When I went down to Stax and I saw four guys come into the studio, hang up their coats, take out their instruments, and start playing music. It might have been a tune, it might have been a chord progression, it might have been a two-bar figure, but before they got through, there was a finished piece of music with the necessary embellishments, and it turned out to be an arrangement, just as much as an arrangement by Percy Faith or Henry Mancini, because the arrangement was not necessarily notes on the clef sheets. The arrangement was the totality of what emerged. And so I got the notion of bringing Wilson Pickett down there because he and I were not getting off the dime. He was on the label for a year and we just couldn't get together. And I asked Jim Stewart if I could bring him down, and he said that was fine. So we went down there and had a wonderful week. We turned out 6 or 7 incredible records. And then, subsequently, we brought down someone named Don Covey. And I don't know whether there was subterranean politics or subtext that I wasn't aware of, but I was told that we weren't welcome to bring our people down there. Our arrangement continued in a very friendly way. In the meantime, a fellow named Joe Balkan, who was on the road for us, and whose MO was chaos. Would you say that?
I think so. That's a good description.
He said, listen, there's this place in Muscle Shoals, you're going to get to see this fellow Rick Hall. And Rick and I got together on the phone, and we began by distributing some of his records for national distribution. Am I right, Rick? Is that how it started? Jimmy Hughes in particular?
Absolutely.
And I heard this music, and I said, that's a pretty good band. So I said to Rick, what about if I come down here and we put a record together with a guy named Wilson Pickett? That, in a very long-winded and tedious way, is how I got here.
Sam, in 1945, you moved to Memphis where you began working with black blues artists. Why did you decide to make that move, and what were you hoping to accomplish at that time that wasn't possible here in Muscle Shoals?
Well, I've been in radio since about 42. And I had moved from Florence over to Decatur, 40 miles to the east. From there to WLAC in Nashville. And there at WREC in Memphis. And when I got to Memphis, I wasn't aware that the Peabody Hotel was putting on big bands. I understand Buddy Killen's going to put out a big band album. I might be a part of that somewhere, buddy. But anyway, a couple of years before that, I thought I'd never see a big band. I was playing the only radio station in town at that time was WLAY. It had started out as WNRA, National Recovery Act, and government made them change the call letters and went to WMSD, which was Muscle Shoals District, then WLAY. But anyway, I got on quite by accident on WLAY, and then, when I got to Memphis, and somehow the other Hart Wooten, who owned WREC, which was a CBS affiliate, he kind of liked the way I picked the records, and finally gave me the assignment of going through all of the records that they had saved from the 20s when they went on the air. And Hart Wooten did not throw away anything. God, I wish I had all those records that I threw away when I went through this catalog. But anyway, basically, Memphis, Tennessee had a fascination for me. And I feel like that even though I was working at a wonderful radio station and doing what I thought I'd never be able to do, is to work with the big bands and feed them not only to the local radio station but to the CBS network when radio was king, outside the newspapers, Terry. But the thing crossed my mind from the day I got in Memphis, Tennessee in 1945, June, that Beale Street had not left me from the year 1939 when I went through there and saw these wonderful people, black folks. Now you have to transpose yourself back in time if you can, and I'll keep this as short as possible. But there was something when Mr. Wooten told me, go through this, categorize the records, index them and do all of this, and so we can have a real up-to-date, handy library. And he said, now when you need some new records, they didn't give them away then, you had companies did, you had to go buy them. Well, guess where I went? I went to Beale Street, they had a record shop called Home of the Blues. Well, by God, you know, nobody in the world working at WREC with any sense at all would have gone to the Home of the Blues on Beale Street to buy records for WREC. Well, I did anyway, and I got Reuben Cherry, who was running the place, and I said, Reuben, start stocking some of these big band, so-called New York arrangements. I'll have an excuse to come down here. But anyway, basically, in my heart, I knew that I had to play around some way with some of the sounds that I had heard as a child and felt, and I just was interested in sound and what it could do for people. And I didn't have any money. I had 2 kids, and a wife, and a deaf-mute aunt, and I was the youngest of 8 young'uns, and so I looked around, I guess, for a year and a half for some little storefront building or something I could rent. Still, I starved my family to death, my mother and my aunt. So finally, in essence, I found this little storefront building for $75 a month. And I did that, and I worked from 7:30 till 3:30 in the afternoon, took care of the Peabody PA system, go out and handle building the studio, and then auditioning nothing but black artists at that time for the first 3 years. But anyway, it's a long story and could get real boring, but at that time it was a desire of mine, and had I not done it, I would have never been satisfied with the idea that there wasn't something in the music that I had heard as a child when I was living in Florence, Lauderdale County.
mentioned that practically the day after you graduated from high school, you had a job at the Grand Ole Opry and headed to Nashville. You were obviously a man with a plan. You knew where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do. What were your aspirations and what did you find when you arrived in Nashville?
Terry, you are totally wrong. Truthfully, I had no plans. When I grew up down here, you either went to work when you got out of school, you went to work to Reynolds Aluminum, or you went to Detroit on the assembly lines. That was it. And truthfully, I guess I was just fortunate because I had become a good enough musician that I could work with the professionals, but I was given an opportunity, and I had no plan. And all I wanted to do was play, and I got up there and I starved to death almost for a couple of years because Nashville was a wonderful place, but if you weren't connected in the proper way, you could be out because most of the good players already had the jobs. They had the connections, and I didn't. And the first 7 weeks I worked on the road, and when that tour was over, I was through. I didn't have a job, so I would stay up all night at WSM Radio and wait for the early morning shows in case a musician didn't show up. Then I could play with a star that was on those early morning shows and sign the card. So I'd make $7 here and $3 there, whatever it was. And I started freelancing a lot, getting to know the people. But the first couple of years were really tough. I went to Wheeling, West Virginia, as part of a comedy act for 3 months. I was going to be a comedian, but everybody just laughed at me. So it was really a struggle. And when they came and drove my car away, GMSC drove up in front of my little nasty apartment and drove my car away in Wheeling, West Virginia, I stood there with tears in my eyes. I said, this is it. This will never happen to me again. So I hitched a ride back in a van. I took my wife and baby and what few belongings I had and went back to Nashville and got busy. And I became very, very energized and very determined. And from that moment on, things started happening for me as a musician. And then I got an opportunity to go to work with this brand new company called Tree Publishing Company, which is a whole other story. And I'm sure, we'll get there tonight sometime, but that's how I got started, and I really didn't have any plan. I want to say one more thing. The most important word, and it's just a very, very small word, that we could use for the success of these guys is called ears. Between those faces sit between some of the smartest, most wonderful ears that you will ever see, because I have had experience with all of them, and they know a great song and a great artist. Jerry Wexler, Sam, and Rick. Rick, from the beginning, would bring his product or artist up to me, and Tree, and James Joyner did, and some of the people that were trying to get something going down here, and I'd open some doors for them, get them started with introducing the people. And it was a wonderful thing, but if they had not had the ears, it would not have happened for any of us. So, ears.
Yeah. Let me tell you what Rick was in Nashville when we had opened a little satellite studio there, and he said, Sam, it's just not happening here. In the meantime, I had hired Biddy Sherrill, who, believe me, we all know is a fantastic talent, and everybody knows him very well from the watch building. But anyway, Rick was up there, and he had worked his butt off down here, and he just felt like that, well, maybe I ought to go to Nashville too. Well, I knew that you had to have determination in this business. I don't give a damn how smart you are. If you haven't got determination in this business, I would get into something else. Now, anyway, Rick said to me, we were fixing the studio on the 3rd floor of the old Cumberland Lodge building. He said, well, Sam, man, I'd like to come up here and work. I said, Rick, let me tell you something. You go back down there to Muscle Shoals. And I sincerely know damn well it's going to happen for you. Because you are a hard-headed mother. And I really meant this, but I said, if it doesn't work out, you better believe you can come up here anytime you want to. Rick Hall is, to me, a person that I understood from the beginning, but when Jerry Wexler whooped his ass in Sheffield, everything changed around a little bit, and I don't know what happened from there on. But it was an absolute fact that I truly felt, I really did. So many people felt that, gosh, I know what, because I went through the same thing in Memphis, Tennessee, back in the early 50s. It was like 61, maybe 62. And so, Rick, you are a credit. You were mean as hell to people. Well, the thing of it is, you got to do it your way. That's just all it is to it. It's not a damn political game. I'm telling you, and not when independent record people are a whole different breed of creatures on this earth. I can tell you that. So, Rick, you are a different creature on the face of this earth. I love you and admire you, and I really do. And that actually happened. Get him, Jerry.
Well, Rick, Sam started my question for me, so I'm going to finish it. Once you got to Muscle Shoals, you formed that partnership with Billy Sherrill and a guy named Tom Stafford. That didn't work out. Sherrill went off to work for Sam Phillips up in Nashville. You wanted to
Big
go.
bucks.
Yeah. You wanted to go to Nashville, but that didn't happen. You stayed here. What made you stay here, and what were the consequences of you digging your heels in and staying in Muscle Shoals?
Well, I wanted to go to Nashville, of course, but it was kind of thought in Nashville that I didn't have the talent, so I had a hard time getting in. I went to Nashville, and Buddy was helpful. He was further along in the business and in the industry than I was, and of course, Sam Phillips was my idol, still is. He was my idol, my inspiration. I saw what he was doing with Jerry Lee, I saw what he was doing with Elvis, saw what he was doing with Johnny Cash, saw what he was doing with just a number of others, Carl Perkins and on and on. I couldn't believe that any one man could sign up 5 or 6 acts and all of them be superstars. So I was inspired by that. I was also inspired by Jerry Wexler and his label particularly. I didn't know anybody at the time at Atlantic Records, but I was certainly aware of their success and the history of their music. And we played in bands, and we always played most of their music. I could sing and play just about any record they had out. And it was, the Drifters, the Coasters, the Ray Charles, and all the great acts that they had that inspired me, and I wanted to be a part of that movement. When I was playing in Phil Kelman, when I was a young man, I wanted to be a country musician and play in Nashville and play on the Grand Ole Opera. Of course, everybody did in this part of the country because we were rural, poverty-stricken people, and all we knew was country music. And of course, our dream was to move uptown and come to the Muscle Shoals or to Nashville or wherever. But as I became older and played in country bands and in good country bands, and became more aware of country music, I loved it and could play it. I realized that the real money, the big bucks, I didn't think was in country music. At that time it wasn't, because if you sold, Hank Williams Sr. could sell, have a #1 record, sell 50,000 albums. Well, I found out to my surprise that you record labels wasn't excited about an album that sold 50,000. They wanted one that sold 5 million. So I wanted to get with the labels that were selling the pop music, and particularly the R&B music, and things that were happening, which were the Ernie Cados, Stand By Me's, and the stuff that was coming out of New Orleans, that Jerry was a part of that movement, and Memphis, of course, with Jim Stewart and Stax and Otis Redding and all the people. Well, I played in bands, and we played that kind of music and knew what the response was at colleges like this college, and that's where the money was. So I wanted to be a part of that, so I felt I had to move to Muscle Shoals to get in the midst of this whole movement. So I gave up the country music band I was in, and we formed a rock and roll band. Billy Sherrill was one of the players in the band. There's 5 of us, and we called ourselves the Fairlanes, which was in those days, cars were it, you know, the Fleetwoods. So we thought the ticket was to find a name that sounded good and it would be a hit act. So Billy and I began to write songs and sleep in the
Ford was big at that time, too.
yeah, they were.
The young people you don't.
That's right. So we had a name, Rick. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, Sam. We began to form our plan of attack and the process of eliminating all the competitors and moving up the ladder and putting them out of business. So Billy moved to Nashville, split us up, and I was in Florence, and so I moved across the river to Muscle Shoals and rented the old tobacco warehouse and started by myself, and we have been in Muscle Shoals ever since. It had nothing to do with Florence or Muscle Shoals or anything of that nature. It was a place that I could get the cheapest at the time and spend the least money in order to bring it up to par so that I could cut a demonstration record to take to town. Anyhow, I got with Atlantic. I'm going to cut this off right away. I got to Atlantic with Jerry, and I had called his attention to Percy Sledge, When a Man Loves a Woman, and then we had done some things with Clarence Carter, who's a great singer from Montgomery, Alabama, and he had picked him up, and we'd made a label deal in the meantime. I was fascinated with the label and what they were doing and how they did it, the family style, the treatment in New York, and it was a fun thing, you know, it was a challenge. And you could have a record, you could cut a record one day and it'd be on the market the next day. I like that. Yeah. Now you go to CBS Records, you cut a record today and they start talking about next Christmas it'll be out. Not this Christmas, but next Christmas. We've got to have time to set this thing up. So anyhow, that's part of my story, but of course it's much more complex than that. But as Buddy said earlier, and I don't take any credit for having great ears, but I'll tell you, if you're going to be in the music business, there's 2 things you need. You need to know a hit song when you hear it, and you need to be prepared to kill. To kill, be killed for a hit record. If you're willing to do those things and you have a little bit of talent and are willing to work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 20 years, you might get a hit record. But it's tough. But if you have that kind of desire, I think you ought to get in the music business.
When you're killing, don't kill any guitarist. Don't kill any guitarist or bass player.
That's right.
Jerry, the next question is for you, and it does concern ears. Once you began traveling to the South and visiting Muscle Shoals, what did you hear in Muscle Shoals that you felt made this area so ripe, not only for rhythm and blues, but rhythm and blues on a grand scale with performers like Wilson Pickett and Aretha Franklin and so many others?
It was the musicians. You know, studios, bricks and mortar, glass and wires, and they did have a plethora of studios here, considering the size of this area, and considering the state of the art at the time, they were adequate. or slightly less. But it was the players. And also, it was the example set by the pioneers here, like Rick, who were generating such fantastic records in the genre, which was my life. It's where I got my mail, rhythm and blues. And I suddenly discovered there's a pretty common thread. These other guys, country boys, who often profess, oh man, we don't like country music. Well, they love it, they just don't like to play it. That's the truth. And there was a common thread, and my life, in strange ways and certain connections, not all of them were business connections, although I did want one terrific business connection, which I couldn't score, because there was a time when Sun Records was very quiet and nothing was coming out. And I called up Sam and said, Sam, for God's sake, let's put out some Sun Records, we'll produce them and distribute them. And he thought about it and he gave it to Shelby Singleton. However, Buddy Killen, Sam, we share certain rather abstruse and rather a reach, these connections. And one of them was Paul Ackerman, who was my editor at Billboard. Paul, and I'll say this, I don't know if you guys knew that, but I really got started, I got Paul started very much in country music by giving him 6 albums that RCA had put out on Jimmy Rogers. That's what turned Paul on, because before that, Paul was a Broadway guy, musical guy, and Paul was a saint, I think you'll all agree, and he was such a highly evolved human being. He had his master's degree in English literature and the late poets, and he ran a tough music department. And I don't know how this happened, but he became friends with a fellow named Jack Stapp in Nashville. To this day, I have no idea what the glue was, what the cement was. But the next thing you know, it led to an assistant or an apprentice for Jack Stapp, who wound up being a pal of mine and a man who produced, and again, a man who had the biggest country music publishing company in the world, if I'm not mistaken, Buddy Killen, winds up sending me fantastic rhythm and blues records. Now, isn't this odd?
Yeah.
Here's Sam with Ike Turner and Jackie Brenston and Rufus Thomas, long before Sam changed world culture with a guy named Elvis Presley. So these are my connections, and my connection with Rick Hall, who opened the door for me, and with his gracious hospitality, permitted me to come in and use his premises and use his band. And sometimes I'm not 100% sure that he was happy with the way things went. However,
Yeah, we made a lot of money together.
right. However, in my heart, I believe that we have an abiding affection for each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
As
Respect.
is the case. And just one more thing I want to say about Buddy. There's about 8 million people who claim that they saw Willie Mays make that catch in the 1954 World Series off Vic Wertz. I was there, I saw it. About 7 million people claim they were in the car with Hank Williams when the tragedy occurred. But Buddy Killen was there.
Not in the car, but working with him as
Working
a
with
bass
him.
player.
And so, isn't it odd that country music, which seems so different and so disparate from rhythm and blues, there's really no difference. It's all good music. It's based on good chord progressions and the good kind of melodies that can lay on top of them and play them in tune. And both of them, most often, have a common basis, which is the church. And I want to say this about it, is that these gentlemen and the players here, black and white, had a communality of life. The same red mud was between their toes. They knew how to fix a carburetor. They knew all of the things that they shared, black and white. And when the big English invasion came, it came from people who learned their music from phonograph records. These people and their musicians learned the music together, regardless of color, because it was organic and it came up from the ground. They pretty much lived the same kind of life because black and white, most of them were poor and at the bottom end of the agrarian ladder. Most of them had church-based influences, and some of them even had tambourines in their churches.
Let me say something about Jerry. Jerry was talking about Paul Ackerman was Billboard magazine, for you people that are maybe not familiar with trade publications. Paul was, as Jerry says, one of the most schooled people in just about everything, including music, of course. The Brill Building in New York, where you had so much music coming out of there during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But I can tell you that without Paul Ackerman, and I believe Jerry probably knew Paul better than anybody, and I got to know Paul real well. And you're talking about a person that was a universal judge, that was so fair. And when he began to hear the record reviews that y'all would have, I believe, on Monday when you was with Billboard, when you did Jerry, the records that came in, Paul began to listen to these things that Jerry had just spoken about, and he absolutely said, this is music from the heart, because he felt that the old Jimmy Rogers stuff and was just something that all around the water tank. And what is greater than that when you go through the lyric? But anyway, Jerry, you and Paul Ackerman, and this is before Jerry left Billboard. He was on their staff there as a writer. And I don't know what else he did, chase women up and down the hall. But he was and Paul were responsible for a lot of what happened. And the osmosis that took place between black and white Southern music that found its way around the world and improved the relations and feelings and brought a lot of joy to a lot of people. Jerry, you are to be commended.
Thank you. Can I just say something about that, about Paul Ackerman and Billboard? I had left Billboard, and I guess Elvis came along in '54.
Yeah.
And Elvis's music was not appreciated in every Southern music center, how can I put it? To the point where a delegation of some very distinguished music publishers from Nashville, I knew them well, I'm not going to call their names now. I think they went up in a body up to New York to try to force Paul Ackerman to exclude this new kind of adjective music from the country music charts.
That's right.
And Paul Ackerman told them exactly what they could do with themselves. And he and Sam cemented an incredible bond. I mean, Damon and Pythias. And Paul was down here one time, and he came down sick, needed surgery. And this wasn't put into Billboard or advertised over the radio. But Sam took fantastic care of Billboard's, of Paul Ackerman, saw that he got the right medication and maybe probably a little financial help. And he did for Paul Ackerman what he later on did for Dewey Phillips.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and Paul did for all of us more than, I'm sitting here the most blessed person in the world because I could sit and listen to these people. And I've been rocking around in music through radio and records for a long time, but this is fascinating to me, and I don't want to take up their time, but Terry Pace and Robert Palmer, Noel Nash, and I sat over at the Music Hall of Fame this afternoon. This is a fantastic treat for me to be here and to have Jerry come all the way from New York. And he can't chase women anymore, so that wasn't an incentive. We had plenty of women around.
Hey, we got Viagra.
I really do want you people to know, and I don't want in the hell this place ain't hanging from the rafters, because I honestly have been in this business more or less all of my life. Quote unquote, that is sound business, S-O-U-N-D. Sometimes it wasn't quite so sound, was it, in the gamble. But I could listen to them because it's a fascinating thing what sound can do and has done for people around the world that started right here and in Memphis, Tennessee, and later on it was banded together to change the world of music altogether. And thank you so much for you like this occasion or not, Jerry. Every one of you people should know Paul Ackerman. I know him because I talk to Paul every damn day. I really do. Paul's been gone, what now, 20 years plus?
Sam, Jerry mentioned a song that you recorded in 1951 called Rocket 88 by Jackie Brinston and the Delta Cats. That single has been widely acclaimed as the first true rock and roll record. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, I'd be the last one to judge that. I'm going by probably the Bible of historians so far as I'm concerned, although I don't think he considered himself before he died, Paul Ackerman. I think he was a historian. I think he was a complete contemporary. I think he was a brilliant man. I said he would be the finest judge of the world. We had a Paul Ackerman, we wouldn't have any wars. But now Paul had a temper about like Rick Howell. I mean, he was going to raise holy hell. But I like people like that. I like to run sometimes and get away from folks and just go back and find out and pick their brain. But, what was the damn question? Jackie. Well, I can't answer that. I really cannot. That is from the professors and people like Paul Ackerman and this guy here, Jerry Wexler. Don't let anybody kid you. He knows, and I'm not talking about the fundamental notes and all of that jazz. I'm talking about the fundamental feel. And that was what was given to it, and that goes ahead of a record that I would think that most people think is the first rock and roll record, pure rock and roll record, would be Bill Haley and Rock Around the Clock, and I'm sure all of you know that, a lot more than know Rock 88. But that is for somebody else to determine. But I do feel at that time, and from checking with the distributors, and I had something like, I think 47 distributors from Maine to California that time for some records. And, chess records, and it was a record that sold, and you can find out from the jukebox operators who plays it. You can find out from the retail outlets, and I can tell you, a lot of the distributors and stuff told me that it was a record that they had sold more than they ever hoped to. And believe me, one of the important things was they were talking about a car that had just come out that appealed to young people, the Oldsmobile Rocket 88. And Rick, I think, was talking about appealing to the younger people. We had to, because all of us old folks, of course I wasn't old at that time. But sometimes we become a little jaded, so I'm so glad that we have new crowd coming along all the time. I'll let somebody else judge Rocket 88. I think it is.
And Sam, since Rocket 88 has been called the first rock and roll record, you have been called the father of rock and roll. And of course, you discovered the man who was known as the king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley. What were you looking for when you did discover Elvis Presley? And then how did later artists like Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins fit into that rockabilly style that was so indicative of Sun Records?
As I say, sound is something that to me means more than sight, because it is sight to me. But I really, I guess I've never been a conventional cat. I've got to do it the hard damn way, you know. I really do. I am interested in looking behind a tree or a bush or a shrub or whatever, or something maybe somebody else walked over. Now, it's not because I'm brainy and bright and all of this stuff, and hey, I absolutely enjoyed thinking what in the world that I can do that will give an inertia to music, because really the big bands were beginning to cool off after the war, and they had their circuits that they were playing. I knew that the toughest time in the world for young people, or people period, was in their teens. They had no music. I would go up the Skyway and put on the broadcast every night, 6 nights a week, 30 minutes, 10:30 to 11. You didn't see any young people out there dancing and having fun. They had nothing they could call their music. And so I guess I just had to look at the idea of trying to make whatever time I had in this world worthwhile, not only from a financial standpoint, but I will say this. I never went in a recording studio in those early days, and even later on, thinking that I'm going in here and got a hit record to make $1 million. I loved it so much. I loved the idea of giving people that had never had an opportunity, poor whites, poor blacks, anybody, that it did something for my soul. It fed my soul. It relieved me. And so many ways of things. And no matter how tired you would get, and I'll say this, it is a time that you have to make decisions. We were talking over at the Hall of Fame, and Rick was telling about a story that they had cut a couple of sides on somebody, and they couldn't make up their mind whether it's going to be the A or B side. And back in those days, you had one side you wanted to push. And of course, Mr. Wexler happened to be around and hear the conversation. I hadn't heard this one, but this is absolutely true. You have got to make decisions for right or for wrong. I mean, you can't be afraid to. So Jerry Wexler stands around, I don't know what the hell he was doing, I don't know, but right now, he said, man, if you can't make up your mind on it, you better not put it out at all. And that's what I'm like. So you really did, and you, honestly, making records, making music, and even if it's a flop, if you're not starving totally to death. And let me tell you something else. Nobody, including myself, has given credit enough to the blacks, the whites that have made this music. I'm telling you, it is an incredible thing when you work a studio. And like Jerry said a while ago, he comes down and he's been used to this New York music, which, Mancini could do some pretty good arranging, let's face it, you know. But Ike Turner would have had a hard time with Mancini, wouldn't he? Huh? But it's a fact, it's an absolute resolute fact, as far as I am concerned, that the fact that you gave these people the opportunity, and you didn't want another Nat King Cole with a black face sitting out there in the studio or standing out there, you let them be what they wanted to be. because they thought if they didn't please the white man, now you got to transpose yourself back to the 50s, 40s and 50s, and even up to the early 60s. So there's so many psychological aspects to this fascinating industry called the music business that I can tell you how important it is to have something like this, to be able to have the opportunity to see you and talk to you. And it's hard to tell it in a short time because it is so many, as Rick said a while ago, there's so many little different things that are involved in the creativity of music, and especially with people that, quote unquote, never made music before. So we are actually, as hard as it was at times for us as independent record companies with very little money, and maybe the equipment wasn't the best, but I differ with you, Jerry. I didn't give a damn what the equipment was. I mean, mic it right and know what you're looking for. I hope you do, and it'll come out all right. But it is today, sound is the most important diplomatic tool we have had in the last 100 years, if not the last millennium. It has brought young people together that had nothing they could call their own all over this world. It's made us all a little closer together. I know they're fighting everywhere, but good God Almighty, we can do that. But let me tell you, people, I talk to at least 200 people a year from around the country to come to see Elvis's home and Beale Street, and sometimes even drop by the Sun Studio. And it is an incredible thing to talk to these people that love what these people have done. And I kid you not, I cannot overstate it. This little area right here, and thanks to the help of people like Jerry Wexler, come down from New York and fool around with us hillbillies, okay? Now, you know, and thanks to people like Rick Hall, hard-headed as hell. You can listen to him when I say, go back down there and stay, Rick. And Billy Sherrill, one of the sweetest guys, greatest guys, and closest friends in the world. And Rick came down here, and I just knew the one thing that I did know, that if anybody in the world could do it, it would be Rick Hall. Now, not that I knew that damn much about his ear and all that good stuff, but I knew that you had to have that certain determination when you might have to go a long time before anything was proven at all, one way or the other. That's the bad part about it. If you know you're totally lost right now, that's one thing. If you keep hoping and say, hey, man, you still got a chance. And those are the things we went through, and these people contributed. And, of course, many others. But you're looking in the faces of some of the absolutely most dedicated human beings. And after a while, as I said a while ago, you can sit, I can sit, and I've been in the damn business a long time. I could sit and listen to these people do, any one of them, a half a day, just do a monologue to me and just tell me his experiences. And many, many other people that were involved in it too. Especially if Jerry bring along about a half a gallon of whiskey. Okay, thank you.
You know, Jerry has a book out, there's a wonderful book that tells a lot about the past and the early days of well, race music and before it became rhythm and blues to us. It's a great book. Now, I will tell you something. I've never known a man who can use every word in the English language like he does. And believe me, he put them all in that book. So get your SARS ready. But it's a wonderful book, Jerry, and I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Buddy, this question is for you.
Okay.
Soon after Elvis left Sam's Sun label, he signed with RCA, which was a big thing. About the same time, you discovered a song for Tree called Heartbreak Hotel. That song became Elvis' first smash on his new label. So in a sense, one Florence native had passed the Presley torch off to another one. What impact did Heartbreak Hotel have on your own career?
Oh, that was amazing. Let me tell you very quickly how that happened. I was playing a little club. I got a chance to go down for 2 or 3 weeks, and it's called Mellow Club in Daytona Beach. And the guy couldn't pay us for playing, but he gave us a place to stay and fed us. And so while I was down there, Mae Axton, who was living in Jacksonville, Florida at the time, came up to Daytona Beach, and somehow she always knew where I was. She followed my career from the beginning. And so she came over, and I said, "What are you doing here?" She said, "I'm here to see the Colonel. He's got a package show over here at the auditorium." She said, "You want to go over with me?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'd like to go over for a few minutes, but I have to get back because I have to work in the club tonight." So we went over, and on the show was Andy Griffith. He had a record out called What It Was Football, and Hank Snow, and Elvis Presley. And Elvis was just really beginning to do something, make noise. Whatever city he went into, when he went out of there, they knew about him, didn't they, Sam? And so at any rate, she came back over after her meeting with the Colonel. And during one of the breaks, I said, "Hey, I'm working for a new publishing company now. You've written some songs for people. How about writing something for me?" She said, "I've got one song." I said, "What is it?" She said, "A song called Heartbreak Hotel." And she said, "I'll send it to you." So when I got back to Nashville, there was a little 5-minute reel, and on it was a guy named Glenn Reeves. He was a disc jockey down in Jacksonville. He was singing it, and he was singing it like Elvis. Well, Elvis was notorious for. Wait a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what happened in between. I heard the song, of course, and liked it. I sent it to Bob Neal, who was managing Elvis. I called him and told him I was sending it to him. He showed it to Elvis, and Bob called me and told me he liked it. Well, during that time was about the time that Sam started talking to Steve Sholes about making a deal for Elvis. Well, when I heard that was going on, I sent a copy of the record of the song to Steve Sholes for Elvis, and Steve called me back and he said, "I like it. We're coming to Nashville. We're going to do Elvis." Well, Mae Axton told me that she had run into Elvis in the lobby of the old Andrew Jackson Hotel, and they went up to his room, and she played the tape for him, and he really liked the song too. So it was meant to be. But the fun part about this story is Glenn had done it singing like Elvis, so when the record you hear on Heartbreak Hotel was Elvis singing like Glenn Reeves, singing like Elvis. Every note. But it was the most amazing thing that, all of a sudden this record came out, and we'd never had anything like that happen in Tree before. We'd had a couple of #1 records, Jim Reeves and the Leuven Brothers and people like that. But when that song came out, that was the most astounding thing I'd ever seen, because it just immediately exploded, pop, rhythm and blues, which no one had ever done. I don't guess had anyone white ever had a rhythm and blues record like that? Top 10? I don't think so. And country and #1 country, it was just the most exciting. Yeah, it was the most exciting time for me because I'd never even touched anything like that, but it was a great time for me. Had a tremendous influence on our company.
Rick, by the mid-1960s, you were known throughout the music industry as a white Southern producer who could make hot hit records for black artists. What was it like in those days, being a white producer in the rigidly segregated South, working in an integrated environment in the recording studios here in Muscle Shoals?
Well, that's a good question. It didn't affect me that adversely. I really don't know why, except for the fact that I was going through an era in my life when, after Sam and Elvis and several other things began to happen, it was commonplace to go to the University of Alabama to play a fraternity party and play all black music. And the kids would throw you out if you didn't. So colleges and young adults, particularly in colleges, where we played and made our livelihood on weekends, we had to play black music. It was the end thing. So it wasn't anything strange to me because I loved it. I loved that kind of music. I don't know why I became intrigued by it, but I loved it. There was several of us that were kind of a clan that all did. Our band, and of course the Dan Penns and the Spoon Rollins and the Jimmy Johnsons and the people that were in most of the Shoals General area, David Briggs, Mark Putnam, etc., etc. All were somehow bitten by this new found music. And as I recall, most of the big records of that era were by black artists. All in the Game. Tommy Edwards, exactly. Benny King, Stand By Your Man. Stand By Me, excuse me. That was later. And these were the kind of things that were taking place, and we were all in love with it. So it was the kind of music I loved, and consequently the musicians that were working with me loved it. And it was kind of a grassroots thing where we all got involved in it, and we wasn't too concerned about politics or what was going on in the government. We were concerned about each other. We loved each other, cared for each other. We loved music, and we wanted to have hit records, and wanted to see our name in lights, and we wanted to make headlines. That was it. And as Sam so adequately put earlier, I believe it was Sam, I never had any intentions of thinking one day I'm going to be rich and be speaking at UNA or talking to this group of people.
You consider yourself rich?
No, I still don't. I never was concerned at all about the money end of the thing. Of course, I might have been if I hadn't got paid for something. But I did it because I loved the music, and I loved producing records, and I was a musician, a songwriter, a publisher, an entrepreneur, a record label owner, etc., studio owner, and grew into all these things overnight, and one day woke up with them all. I didn't realize where they came from, but had a lot of things in my life. But, and I want to say another thing about Buddy. That I think I talked so much about Jerry and Sammy that I forgot about Buddy. But Buddy was, out of these people on the stage here, these are three important people in my musical career, in my psyche, my mental capacity, what I wanted to do, how they'd done it. I listened to Jerry's every word on the telephone, how he handled himself, how he cut me off and said, I don't want to hear about mom and the kids, I want to hear about the music business. I'm busy, I've got 500 calls waiting on me. These are all the things that taught me how to become a better businessman and get on with the program. Of course, Sam was also, Buddy was also. Buddy was, we here in Florence kind of look to Buddy as the guy who went overseas and made good, He went to Nashville, and we'd hear back through the grapevine that he's got this, and he's got that. He's been with Hank Williams. He's been on all the sessions. He's a top call guy on the bass, and I saw that when I went to Nashville. He was one of the top bass players up there, and he was on everybody's sessions. But he was also influential to me because it was the first publishing company, his and Acuff Rose, that I didn't know what they were. What is a publishing company? I thought, But his was one of those kind of things, and he was always a man about town, and you'd see him on all the parking lots pitching his songs and glad-handing people and whatever it took to get the job done. But Buddy was terribly influential in my life, and was always a good friend and companion, and later on brought me songs from Mac Davis and Paul Anka and people like that, and we made some money together. But there's two other people that's not here that I want to also mention that were terribly important in my life. One of them was Bill Lauer out of Atlanta, Georgia. And there's more than these, but of course Leonard Chess, who's, rest his soul, he's been dead for a while, but he These are all people that believed in me, believed in Muscle Shoals, believed in the people in the South, and gave us an opportunity. And to answer your question, it never struck me, never crossed my mind whether I was black or white or they were black or white. It just happened to be that I loved their singing or what they sounded like and the songs they wrote and what it did to my soul.
Jerry, this question is for you. Given the scenario that Rick just described, you arrived in Muscle Shoals at a time when outside the studio door, blacks and whites didn't mingle. Inside the studio door, there was no line. And you told an interesting story today. You told how Dan Penn, a white singer, played a crucial role in showing a black singer, Wilson Pickett, how to sing a song by a fellow black singer, Otis Redding. Once you arrived in the South, what did you learn about the chemistry between black musicians and white musicians in Muscle Shoals Studios?
Good subject, and I'm absorbed by it. Despite segregation, whether it was a cultural thing in the South and a de facto thing in the North, blacks and whites played together in the studios as far back as the 20s. You scholars of country music here know that Louis Armstrong played on 2 records of Jimmy Rogers. So that's going back quite a bit to show the homogeneity and the lack of prejudice among musicians way back in the early days, in the jazz days. There's a contemporary musician who I consider to be a genius in his own right, Mac Rabenak, Dr. John, who is so black in his sound and in his approach and the way he thinks, that in the days when they had segregated locals, and some of you may be too young to remember that, but there'd be a black musician's local and a white musician's local in every city, and there was no mixing, but that was a union thing. But the musicians themselves would get together in the studio and also to do a lot of jamming, especially in the jazz days. But Mac Rabenak, Dr. John, this Stone Kunash, belonged to the black local. And this was just something that he opted for. And they had a trashy kind of thing on television last week, I'm sure it was shown down here, called Shake, Rattle, and Roll. And it was a corny story about these young high school kids, how they form a band and they hear black music and so on. But there was a very interesting episode there where there's a dance and the band is playing and the blacks are playing here and the whites are playing here with a rope between them. But the rope came down. And that is a thing that happened time and time again in gigs in the South. It was in the South that Caucasians first started really picking up on black music. In the days when the transistor radios came in and the kids went to the beach, they called it beach music, and they heard Horace Allen and John Richburg playing Fats Domino and Laverne Baker. And this was like a really salty chili dog to them after Patti Page and Perry Como. And they became infatuated with it. Fraternity boys at Southern colleges, people who were studying drinking at the University of Virginia, they latched onto this music, and we started getting calls from our distributors, like in Charlotte and in New Orleans, saying, man, white people are starting to buy this music. And of course, this was the progenitor of rock and roll, because first white people started to buy the music, and some of them imagined that they could play it, even though they couldn't. And eventually, some of them learned how. And which brings me to the subject of my 4 favorite musicians: Barry Beckett, David Hood, Jimmy Johnson, Roger Hawkins. Who, as I said, 4 Southern boys who couldn't help but being bathed in a total wash of country music, but who somehow took a left turn toward the blues. They didn't go up to Nashville to play 3 and 4 chord stuff, and I don't mean to denigrate that at all, because on some simple harmonic basis, some of the most beautiful top lines came out with great lyrics and great songs. But these guys were interested in a different kind of complexity. I also learned, coming from the North, although it was not a totally new experience to me, because in my very young days, I went to school in Kansas, and you wouldn't say that Kansas is exactly Southern, but Midwest Kansas had a lot in common in terms of folk culture and attitude and how things intermingled. And so when I came south, I was not totally indoctrinated with the notion that when I came down here, I was going to find the worst kind of oppression and bodies dangling from trees and so on. And I found out that there was more of a kinship between the races here than well-educated northern people could ever begin to imagine. And because it wasn't ghettoized, it was checkerboarded. Yeah, there was always a back of town when the freight trains went by, but in the South, blacks and whites lived together, they conversed together. That's not to say that there wasn't the horror of the terrible things we remember. But at the same time, I learned the other side of this. And I worked here in 4 decades, I guess, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I never heard one musician or anybody that I was associated with ever use the N-word. And so I came to learn, it broadened me as a person about the diversity of America and the total misinformation that had been broadcast about race relations in the South.
Sort of to follow up on this black-white theme in Southern music here, Jerry mentioned this earlier. Buddy, you have been accurately described as the Quincy Jones of country music, with so many different interests and successes and roles in turning Nashville into a world-class center of recording and publishing and all sorts of other musical endeavors. However, you also did dabble in rhythm and blues. And you had a dynamic discovery of your own named Joe Tex. What was the chemistry with Joe Tex, and how did Joe Tex bring you back home to Muscle Shoals?
Buddy, let me cut you off.
Okay.
Dabbling is not the word. There was some heavy-duty business went on here.
Diving, man.
You know,
A lot of legal work.
I got married, and I was on my honeymoon, and Jerry Crutchfield was my assistant, and he called me down in Florida, and he said, "You got to get home." And I said, "Why? I'm on my honeymoon." He said, "No, you got to come home. There's a guy here, he's a black guy, and I don't know what he's got, but it's good. And you got to come back and hear it." And I said, "But I can't do that." He said, "Buddy, you got to get back." And I left down there on my honeymoon and came back. And the next morning, Joe Tex is sitting in my office. And so Jared introduces me, and he says, "Play him something." So Joe gets so late, he can only play with 2 fingers on the piano. Was the piano player. But he started singing. I said, "Well, I don't know what he's got either, but boy, that's good. And so I took him and tried to get somebody in Nashville to sign him, some of the record labels. Well, they didn't know what he was either, because, I mean, they didn't know anything about rhythm and blues, really, because they were really more interested in country music. Well, I started Dial Records, so I could put his record out. And Walt McGuire with London Records made a deal with me to distribute the records. Well, for about 4 years, we never could really hook a hit. Joe and I was going to the studio, and I was trying to have my influences on it, and he wanted it his way, and he'd storm out, we'd argue, and it was just not a nice thing when we go to the studio, because I wasn't understanding what he was trying to do, and he wasn't understanding what I wanted. So after about 4 years, we sold a few records. I was tired of the way I was being treated by the distributing company anyway. But Joe called me one day and he said, look, man, he said, we're good friends and we enjoyed, we like each other and everything, but we haven't had any success with our records. Why don't you turn me loose? You always said you would. I said, I tell you what, I'll turn you loose under one condition. He said, what? I said, let me record you the way I want to. Don't fight me. Let me just record you the way I want to one time. He said, you got it. What do you want to do? I said, I want to take you to Fame Recording Studios down in Muscle Shoals. He said, set it up. So I called Rick, and he didn't have anything but just mono at the time. And no stereo.
Before Wexler came.
Pardon?
Well, you broke your heart.
That was before Wexler came in the
Yeah,
picture.
When
So-
he broke his heart and he got a 3-track.
So,
Right, that's right.
so I believe Joe South came over and played guitar on it. I brought, I think I brought Kelso down from Nashville, a young man named Ronnie Wilkins who worked for me, played piano. And Joe brought his bass player that played like he'd been tasting gin-flavored gumdrops because he missed a note every other beat. So, but he brought Clyde, his drummer. Now that was the combination of the people. We worked for 7 hours on a song called Fresh Out of Tears. Wore everybody out. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. And I just wasn't going to give up that easily, so I accepted some kind of performance on it. And I said, Joe, what was that little ballad you were singing to me the other day? He said, Hold What You Got? And I said, yeah. I said, sing a little bit. So he started, and I said, let's do it. So we worked for another couple of hours on that, and it's just terrible. The musicians, a couple of musicians were so bad, they just couldn't hold it together. And but we got 2 real rough takes on it. And I said, Joe, I got an idea. Why don't you sing harmony on it? We'll go from mono to mono. He said, man, I can't sing in harmony. I said, I'll teach you what to sing. So I taught him the part. And at the same time I was doing the harmonies with Joe, I had Ronnie playing harmony on the arpeggio on the piano. I had Kelso doing the same thing on the guitar, and Joe South, whoever, I forgot who it was. We just went from, we did it twice. We did it on 2 takes. And because each one of them were full of mistakes. Well, after we finished, Rick said, buddy, I'm sorry we didn't get anything, man. We tried. He was engineering it. He said, and we all, it was just so bad. And he said, we tried, and I really appreciate you coming down, and I thanked him. And Joe and I go out, it's 5 o'clock in the morning. We stand out in front of Fame Studios. And Joe sort of, he said, man, we tried. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you later. So I get in my car on the way back to Nashville. And I said, I don't give up that easily. It just bothered me. I am not giving up. So I got back to Nashville and I called RCA Studios and I said, I want some editing time. So I go over and I take these 2 tapes and I find one chorus. I don't know if you've heard the song, but they said, oh, you can count 1, 2, 3, and had the little bell, and
Triangle.
so I found one chorus that held together. And I kept taking little bits here, little pieces here. I edited this tape, and Jerry had told me, he said, but if you ever get away from London, I'd like to have Joe Tex, because I'd done a Dale Hawkins for Jerry, and we talked a lot on the phone. So I called him and I said, I've got this record on Joe Tex, and he said, send it to me. I sent it up to him. The next morning he called me back. He said, buddy, this is a smash. I'm putting it out today. And contrary to what Rick was saying, it takes 2 years now to even get a contract. But I said, but we don't have contracts. He said, we got each other's word. And I said, but we don't have a label. He said, we'll just use a little one color thing. And you know what? He did it. And they immediately started bootlegging it because it was so easy to print, you know. So they put the record out, and instantly it sold 50,000 records. And Joe Tex called me a couple of days later, and he said, and he talked like this, hey man, how you doing? He said, look here man, you done told me you're gonna let me out of my contract. When you gonna send it to me? I said, Joe, we've got a hit. He said, you put that piece of out? I said, yeah, and he hung up. And so about a week later, we sold 250,000 records. And pop stations were picking it up. It was really taking off. He calls me up, and Joe calls me and said, look here, man, you done told me you're going to let me out of my contract. Now, when you going to let me out? I said, Joe, we've sold 250,000 records. Look here, man, what? I said, Joe, we got a smash. He said, what did you do? I said, oh, some little electronic tricks. And he said, man, I ain't going to ever question you again. And we worked together for 22 years after that. You know? But thanks to Jerry, he taught, you know, those years I was telling you about a while ago, he had them. And I would like to tell you one more thing. I did Skinny Legs and all with Joe over in Memphis. And I knew that the track was really a good track, but I couldn't figure out what it was. So I called Jerry, and I just had this little walling sack sitting by the phone. And I said, Jerry, listen to this. So I put it on the phone. I said, I can't figure out what it needs. So I played it for him, and he said, it sounds like it ought to be a live record. I said, that's it. It needs an audience. So I had a guy who worked for me go to the Hall of Fame, the Country Music Hall of Fame, and get a busload of those people to come over to the studio, Columbia Studios. Well, I couldn't play the tape. I bought them a Coke and told them what we were going to do. And I couldn't play the tape loud enough for them to hear it. So I said, I'll stand behind the glass here and I'll tell you what to do. When I laugh, you laugh. When I applaud, you applaud. And Joe would say, who take the girl with skinny legs? And I went in there and opened up, boom. And another place I went, something, whatever. Just those little sounds. Well, when you put, and so we start the tape, and I'm standing in front of the glass, and first time, who take the girl with skinny legs? Everybody's laughing. So they laugh, you know, through the tape. And then when Reggie hits that lick, and everybody applauds, you know. So that's how we made this record. The people were on a million-selling record, an instantaneous million-selling record, and they never even heard it.
Talking about Reggie, the fantastic chemistry when we brought Bobby Womack down here and put him in with Reggie Young, and the two of them came out with a blend that was something brand new. I think both their styles would change forever, and that walk-down lick, that doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, became part of music literature.
When Reggie hit that lick, we were cutting it at Chip's Moment Studio in Memphis, American Studios. When Reggie hit that lick, Joe Tex fell out into the floor and started kicking. I mean, it blew his mind, because that was the most creative lick that I'd ever heard on the guitar too. And as a matter of fact, Tom T. Hall did that record in what was the one Jerry Kennedy did it on the dobro. Was Harper Valley PTA? Also, but Nashville just caught on to that lick, and it did it over and over and over on the dobro. So it was a signature lick that will always be around.
But nobody could play it like Reggie.
Oh, no. He was fantastic.
I have to also tell everyone that when Joe Tex died so tragically and prematurely in 1982, the pallbearers at his funeral included Wilson Pickett, Ben E. King, Don Covey, Percy Mayfield, and Buddy Killen. So there was obviously a very special chemistry between these two.
It was so special. As a matter of fact, Joe told me one time, he said, "You're the only white man I lie down beside. They go to sleep and not worry." And I thought, that's probably the greatest compliment I've ever had, because he had not had a good experience in those cotton fields in Texas. So there's one more quick story, if I can tell it. Joe decided he wanted to be a country singer. He loved Hank Williams. So this was in the beginning of his career. So he got him a guitar. He couldn't play guitar very, just barely. And he booked himself in a club out there in Texas. Well, he's up on stage, and the club owner comes in, and he looks up and sees this black guy in his country club up there, and he said, "No, get him off the stage. He ain't country. He can't be country." And that was the end of his career as a country singer.
Rick, this question's for you. In the early 70s, you switched from rhythm and blues to pop, enjoying great success with everyone from the Osmonds to Paul Anka. Later, you moved back into country music, produced smash hits for Jerry Reed, T.G. Shepherd, and a group that you developed called Shenandoah. What's been the secret to your ability to not only survive, but to anticipate the trends in the music business?
Well, that's a good question. Well, as I told you earlier, I had a good deal of early experience in my early life as a country musician, country songwriter, and I know everything there is to know about country in the early days, particularly. I bought Mac McGarry records, Chet Atkins, like everybody else, Roy Acuff, Red Foley, Ernest Tubb, the Everly Brothers, all the way down to Elvis. So my whole life evolved around country music early in my life. So when I started playing and producing black records and became involved in that, I think it gave me a little broader scope, having known about country music and their legends, and being a country musician myself and growing up in the country in Alabama. So I was pretty diversified by this time. I knew a lot and felt like I was quite adequate in playing blues music, producing blues music, writing blues songs, writing country songs, bluegrass songs, what have you. The area I hadn't exploited was the pop arena. And I was always intrigued by that, because I always wanted to be a little better than I was. An example was that I was always infatuated with New York, and most Southern producers I think are. I think Buddy might have run into this, maybe even Sam. We wanted to produce records like they were producing in New York and Los Angeles. We wanted to produce records with big string arrangements and French horns and oboes and cellos and violas and anything. But we wanted a big production. And I think that came from being a little bit, I guess, for lack of a better word, we were intimidated with that kind of music, thinking that it would make us better people if we could play better and were better educated culturally, etc., etc. So I always wanted to write a big hit song. I mean, I wanted to write a Three Coins in the Fountain. I wanted to write a Love is a Many Splendid Thing. I wanted to, I loved Henry Mancini. I loved that type of music. So when the black music, particularly Southern blues black music, which was what I was doing and what Jerry was doing mostly, and the Wilson Pickett's and the Clarence Carters, when it began to dwindle in the face of disco, and disco became popular, and of course acid rock started to creep into the picture. Those are foreign to me, very foreign. I didn't know how to deal with it. I tried feebly on several occasions to produce a hit record. Went as far as to buy the records, take them in, and almost copy them, or try to copy them, knowing that my best copy would still be, nobody would recognize it as being a copy because it'd be so far away from the original. So when the opportunity came along, I was forced. Our music went away. The music that I was involved in, it was no more. It was over. You know, after Martin Luther King was killed and some other sad events, I had to find another way to make a living in the music business. So I went pop. I did some records on Bobby Gentry. I did the follow-up to Ode to Billy Joe, which was called Fancy. And if you hear it, it was a mixture of the second interpretation of Ode to Billy Joe, along with Muscle Shoals horns and Muscle Shoals musicians' treatment to it.
Nice record.
Thank you. And so we did that, and it was a big success. Then I had made a deal to distribute my label, the Fame label, with the people at United Artists and Transamerica.
He got tired of me.
No. So I made a deal with them, and they wanted me to produce some sides for them, so they put up a bunch of money, front money, and said, look, hire your own promotion staff, be your own man, do what you want to do. And I went at that like crazy and was doing about 12 or 14 albums a year and not doing a good job of it, but began to fail health-wise. My health began to deteriorate. And so I went to LA, checked into the hospital, and they said, you're going to have to back off. So I called Mike Stewart and said, I want out of the deal. Of course, they said, you're crazy, you know. My lawyer said that, Mike Mayer said, you know, take the money and run. I said, I can't, I'm not built that way. I can't, I just can't take somebody's money and not perform for them. So I called Mike and he said, come on out and we'll talk. And so he said, you know, you're crazy. You know, this cost me my job because I took this deal in front of the board and they'll fire me. I said, no, I won't let that happen. I'll produce some acts for you. Who are you going to produce for me? I said, well, what about Paul Anka? He said, I don't want to say what he said, but he said, egotistical, you know what? He said, you know, I knew him in New York and I can't stand him. Besides, he couldn't have a hit record in today's market. So anyhow, we produced, the next record was You're Having My Baby, which sold about 3.5 or 4 million singles. And Mike was happy, but we got out of the deal, needless to say. And so I was doing pop act. Mike Curb came along and said, I've got an act in Las Vegas that I want you to see. I want you to fly over with me from Los Angeles. And I said, I don't want to go to Las Vegas. I don't like it over there. He said, go with me. And I want you to see an act. I want you to produce for me. And I said, who's the act? He said, I can't tell you who the act is because if I do, you won't go. And so I went, and it was the Osmonds, and they were just little guys. I never saw them before because, as Jared will tell you, we were in the studio all the time. I didn't have a chance to watch TV or know what was on the Andy Williams show on Friday night. So I didn't know who they were. But I fell in love with them. And the first record we did, my thinking was, well, the Jackson 5 is a black group, teenage guys, and they're selling a lot of records to young white kids in America and black kids in America. If I could get these white kids to, if I could find a black song and record it where it would be compatible with blacks and whites, I believe they'd have an audience and I'd sell a lot of records. So I went to George Jackson, who was one of our writers at the time and a good friend, And George had written Old Time Rock and Roll, which Jimmy and the guys had done over at Muscle Shoals Sound and was very successful with. I asked him to write me a song like a 1, 2, 3 that the Jackson 5 had at the time, and I wanted to do them with a black approach. And he brought me One Bad Apple, and brought it to me almost in the form that I recorded it in. In fact, I copied the demo. I wished I could have bought the demo and put their voice on it because it would have been much easier. Anyhow, I copied the demo, and it wound up being a huge record and broke them out. So I was off into the pop market, and then came Andy Williams, and of course, and several other pop acts, Liza Minnelli, Mac Davis, and so I had gone from black to R&B and black to from country to R&B to pop, and it was about soon, and I'll end the story here, but was to become a country record producer, which basically is what I'm doing now. Okay?
I have a question. Will you all excuse me for a minute? I'll be right back.
Just to close out the panel tonight, we'd like to give each of you an opportunity to tell us about one particular song, or recording session, or artist that you feel you most closely identify with, or you're most proud of, or that you feel says something particular about your musical legacy. Let's start with Mr. Phillips.
Well, actually, the impossibility of an answer that would be satisfactory to you, Terry, I can't give you, because that's the truth. I cannot think, because each element that I dealt with